Jackson?
Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, and today I'm going to be discussing the numerous child molestation allegations that were made against the musical artist Michael Jackson. There were so many that at one point Jackson was even prosecuted as a result and was eventually acquitted of all of those charges. However, arguably the worst allegations came out after he passed away. They were detailed in a documentary entitled Leaving Neverland, which I highly recommend watching.
Everybody wanted to meet Michael or be with Michael. And then he likes you.
I was 7 years old. Michael asked, "Do you and the family want to come to Neverland?"
We drive in and forget about all your problems. You were in Neverland. It was a fantasy.
The days were filled with magical childhood adventure experiences. Playing tag, watching movies, eating junk food, anything you could ever want as a child.
It's like hanging out with a friend that's more your age.
Just kid things. They were just doing kid things.
He just came across as a loving, caring, kind soul. It was easy to believe that he was just that.
Out of a storybook, right? Out of a fairy tale.
Hello, Wade. Today is your birthday, so congratulations. I love you. Goodbye.
There's no thoughts of this is wrong or anything like that.
He told me if they ever found out what we were doing, he and I would go to jail for the rest of our lives.
Secrets will eat you up. You feel so alone.
I want to be able to speak the truth as loud as I had to speak the lie for so long.
Now, I'm not going to be discussing every allegation or detail in the case because that would take way more than one video, and I'm also not going to go into depth about who Jackson was because he was arguably one of the most famous people to ever live. Instead, I wanted to find a way to touch on some of the more damning things said in the documentary, and I feel like the best way to do that would be to present it through the thoughts of someone who would defend him, and I think one of the best examples of that is the YouTuber Dr. Todd Grande. Dr. Grande is an excellent creator who is rightfully well respected here on YouTube, so I want to make it clear that this video is a criticism of his arguments that he puts forward in his video, not him.
Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel.
I've left links for him in the description. If you've never seen one of his videos, I highly recommend checking him out. Also, before I get started, I want to point out that Dr. Grande does attempt to present both sides of the argument in his video, both for and against Jackson's guilt, but this video does come across to me as leaning pretty heavily towards Jackson's innocence, and I think his thoughts when defending Jackson are honestly a fairly decent reflection of how a lot of other people feel. And I think there's a few great examples that I'm going to point out here, but I think a good place to start is with this.
Is that Michael Jackson was extremely famous, and people tend to want things from celebrities. So he wasn't just like an average famous person. Again, he was off the charts famous. There had never really been another recording artist like Michael Jackson. So just important to keep in mind as I go through kind of the elements that stand out that make him look guilty, and those elements that stand out that I think speak toward him looking more innocent.
So, Dr. Grande brings up Jackson's fame pretty early on in his video, and it's honestly a very common argument amongst people who defend his behavior. He's not exaggerating when he explains just how famous he was.
They filled in the Hollywood Walk of Fame blank space yesterday between Lupe Velez and Lefty Frizzell. But as Lisa Gibbons reports, things didn't go as smoothly as planned.
There were more fans on hand and more security personnel than for the unveiling of any other star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. When the Jacksons' manager announced the group had added 3 Los Angeles performances to their tour, the crowd roared, but that didn't satisfy their impatience to see the star.
If this area does not back up immediately, we will not be able to have the ceremony.
The crowd was almost taken off guard by all the excitement when the long-awaited announcement finally came.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Jackson, and we welcome him to the Walk of Fame.
The characteristically quiet Jackson said a quick thank you and then knelt by his star, the 1,793rd on the Walk of Fame. Michael Jackson's day of celebration was unfortunately marred by an overexuberant crowd, curtailing the ceremony and causing the star and his family to make a hasty retreat.
Michael Jackson is no longer here, so you cannot see him. Okay, off the theater building, right now.
They just started to push the fence over. It was coming down on us, and every time the cops had to take a person away that was fainting or something, there would be nobody left.
If you were young and you weren't around when he was at his peak, it truly is kind of difficult to describe just how famous he really was, but the logic is Michael Jackson was famous, and people were after his money, and people try to exploit famous people, and this argument really only holds so much weight to me. R. Kelly was famous, Jimmy Savile was famous, Bill Cosby, O.J. Simpson, Harvey Weinstein. Famous people can be monsters too. I agree that people do try to sometimes exploit famous people, but the accusations against Jackson were very specific and had common themes amongst people who didn't even know one another.
Only on CBS this morning, 2 men who say that Michael Jackson sexually abused them as children are opening up about their experiences with the pop icon. Wade Robson and James Safechuck are featured in an explosive new documentary that premieres this weekend on HBO. Both men also sued the Jackson estate, but their lawsuits were dismissed because of the statute of limitations. They are appealing that. Jackson has always denied any inappropriate behavior with children. Robson and Safechuck told us about their relationships with Jackson, including very graphic allegations of abuse. A warning here, some of these details are quite disturbing. Before you all met Michael Jackson, what did he mean to you?
I saw the making of Thriller, just instantly became obsessed. I wanted to be just like, and I dressed like him every day and did my hair and had my hair permed to look like him and, you know, all that stuff.
I wasn't necessarily a big fan. And then when I got the commercial,
Mr. Jackson?
The
Pepsi commercial.
Yeah, the Pepsi commercial. When You See Me Meet Him is actually my first time seeing him. You know, at that point I was pretty excited. It was otherworldly, I guess.
James Safechuck and Wade Robson discuss the intimate details of their relationships with Michael Jackson.
Everybody wanted to meet Michael or be with Michael.
In the upcoming HBO documentary, Leaving Neverland. That's the name of Jackson's ranch, where Robson claims 7 years of sexual abuse with the world-famous performer first began.
I mean, this was just the most magical thing I'd ever seen. And that first night, Michael just kind of took us on a little bit of a tour, and he said to me and my sister, you can stay in one of the guest rooms or you can stay in here with me if you want. And my reaction was, of course, I want to stay with you. We had one more night that way that myself and my family were going to leave and go on another kind of vacation to the Grand Canyon. I was devastated to leave Michael. Michael was devastated for me to leave. He actually sobbed.
So you got to stay.
So I got to stay. And so it was just Michael and I in Neverland for the next week.
And your parents allowed that?
My parents allowed that. Within either the first or second night of Michael and I being alone at Neverland, the night started changing. One of the ways I remember it starting is, Michael just sort of starting to touch my legs and touch my crotch over my pants. It progressed to him performing oral sex on me, him showing me how to perform oral sex on him.
Did it scare you? Did you think it was wrong?
A couple days prior to the abuse starting, he started touching me, just in the sense of like, hand on my leg, lots of hugs, kissing my forehead, rubbing my hands. So there'd been this kind of development of physical closeness that was happening already that felt like a father. It just felt amazing. As Michael started doing these sexual acts, he started talking to me about God brought us together. We love each other, and this is how we
love each other.
We love each other, and this is how we show each other our love.
James, you're nodding in agreement to what he's saying. Tell me what happened to you.
He introduced me to masturbation. He said I taught him how to French kiss. And then it moves on to oral sex. But it's
Are you frightened or thinking this is weird or wrong?
No, it's in the context of a loving, close relationship. There's no alarm bells going off in your head or any thoughts like that. Really, it's just, I love this person and we're trying to make each other happy. He said I was his first, but even as a kid, you don't even know what that means. So you're lovers and you're best friends.
What does that mean, James? You're in a relationship and you're lovers. You're a little boy.
Right.
And he's a 30-something man, and you're a little boy. Because at that age, how do you even know what that means?
Well, you don't. You just feel really connected to someone, and you just love them intensely.
The public in general thinks it's violent, that it's very painful, but what you're describing is totally the opposite of that.
I mean, he didn't beat me. He didn't, he never said mean things to me. It was all, we love each other.
Michael Jackson was never accused of inappropriate behavior with young girls, for example. It was only young boys. I wonder why that is. If it truly was a conspiracy to extort money from him, why did no little girls try to do it as well? 100% of his accusers were young boys, without exception. You would imagine that if there truly was an extortion attempt against him, then that wouldn't be such a gender-specific thing. That and the fame argument is ironically kind of a double-edged sword here, because it seems like with famous people there's a willingness to see past what is obviously inappropriate just because they're famous and people love them. I can't help but feel like arguments defending some of the things that Jackson said and did is kind of like defending the emperor when people are trying to point out they aren't wearing any clothes, or in this case sleeping in bed with little boys while they have alarms guarding the room. Dr. Grande does make an attempt to discuss some of the things that point to Jackson's guilt, but more often than not, he almost immediately counters those points just after making them.
So in terms of the factors that we see in Leaving Neverland and the other evidence we have that stand out in terms of like siding with guilt, that make it look like Michael Jackson was guilty, I think one of these components is he formed friendships with young boys and children in general. But I think specifically the boys kind of look suspicious. Michael Jackson and these boys would sleep in the same bed. And this was, of course, a big bed. He had a large bed at the Neverland Ranch, but still, it was the same bed.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that a 40-year-old guy who specifically befriended young boys, moved them into his house and slept in the same bed with them, does seem a touch suspicious, wouldn't you say? It's okay, though. It was a big bed. No one on earth would be defending this kind of behavior if it was anyone other than Michael Jackson, but let's continue.
The next thing is we see a number of photographs, just photographs and video, of Michael Jackson with these boys. And he has his hands on them. They seem very friendly. It just, again, it looks suspicious. I don't think there's any way of getting around it. It doesn't look good. And you could also view it another way, though. Maybe he had nothing to hide and he wasn't really thinking about it, so he just did whatever he wanted in terms of getting photographed and having video taken of him.
Yeah, it does seem weird that there are a ton of photos of an accused child molester being handsy with young boys, but you could also look at it in a positive way. I mean, this doesn't feel like a very objective attempt to discuss what's so obvious to anyone who looks at Jackson's behavior critically. And remember, this is the part where Dr. Grande is making an argument towards Jackson's guilt, but let's continue.
But I think overall this kind of makes him look guilty. Another element here, and I didn't really see great support for this, but there's some evidence available that he had like bells and alarms on the way to his room at Neverland Ranch. As I understand it, Macaulay Culkin testified to this. So, okay, that looks a little bit suspicious, right? Why would you have like devices that make noise as people approach your bedroom? So, again, I'm not sure that was really something that happened, but if it was true, that looks a little bit suspect.
A little suspicious. That, I mean, you can't make this up. A little suspicious that a grown man is sleeping in the same bed as young boys with alarms all over the room if you approach the room. And mind you, later in this video, Dr. Grande is going to make an argument that the results of a trial can't be ignored. They're incredibly important. But Macaulay Culkin here testifying that Michael Jackson had alarms on his room, that's not enough for him to conclude that that's probably something that really happened.
He deserved all the joys of life as any
And so
other
it was that we came back to our meeting at Neverland with 12-year-old Gavin. I'd found this easily the most disturbing moment of the past 8 months.
You know, some have, and they say, is that really appropriate? When you're talking about children, we met Gavin. Mm-hmm. And it was a great privilege to meet Gavin because he's had a lot of suffering in his life.
Yeah.
When Gavin was there, he talked about the fact that he shares your bedroom.
Yes.
Can you understand why people would worry about that?
Because they're ignorant.
But is it really appropriate for a 44-year-old man to share a bedroom with a child who is not related to him at all?
That's a beautiful thing.
That's not a worrying thing?
Why should it be worrying? Who's the criminal? Who's Jack the Ripper in the room? This is a guy trying to help heal a child. I'm sleeping in a sleeping bag on the floor. I gave him the bed because he has a brother named Star. So him and Star took the bed, and I'm on the floor in the sleeping bag.
Did you ever sleep in the bed with them?
No. But I have slept in the bed with many children. I sleep in the bed with all of them. When Macaulay Culkin were little, Kieran Culkin would sleep on this side, Macaulay Culkin's on this side, his sister's in there. We're all just jamming the bed. And we wake up like dawn and go in a hot air balloon. You know, we have the footage. I have all that footage.
But is that right, Michael?
It's very right. It's very loving. That's what the world needs now. More love, more
the world needs
heart.
The world needs a man who's 44 sleeping in a bed with children.
No, you're making it all wrong.
Well, tell me, help me.
Because what's wrong with sharing a love? You don't sleep with your kids or some other kid who needs love, who didn't have a good childhood?
No, I don't. I would never dream of sleeping.
I would
never dream.
Because you've never been where I've been mentally.
What do you think people would say if I said, well, I've invited some of my daughter's friends round or my son's friends round and they're going to sleep in the bed with me tonight?
That's fine.
What do you think their parents would say?
If they're wacky, they would say you can't. But if you're close family, like your family, you know them well, but
Michael, I wouldn't like my children to sleep in anybody else's bed.
Well, I wouldn't mind if I knew the person well, and if I'm very close to Barry Gibb, Paris and Prince can stay with him anytime. My children sleep with other people all the time.
And you're happy with that?
I'm fine with it. They're honest. They're sweet people. They're not Jack the Ripper.
I suppose the problem for many people is what happened in 1993, or what didn't happen.
What didn't happen?
Just cast your mind back. What was that like when you first heard the allegations that were being made against you?
It was shocking, and I'm not allowed to talk about this by way of law. So,
but how did you feel about what was being said? I'm not asking you to talk about what was said.
I was shocked because God knows in my heart how much I adore children.
But isn't that precisely the problem, that when you actually invite children into your bed, you never know what's going to happen?
But when you say bed, you're thinking sexual. They make that sexual. It's not sexual.
But
we're going to sleep. I tuck them in. I put a little music on, and do a little storytelling. I read a book. It's very sweet. Put the fireplace on. Give them hot milk. You know, we have little cookies. It's very charming. Very sweet.
Sure.
It's what the whole world should do.
But anyway, let's get to the parts where Dr. Grande makes an argument towards Jackson's innocence.
So that's what stands out in terms of him looking guilty. How about what stands out in terms of him looking innocent? So the other side of the coin here. Well, in the 1993 case, we see that case was weak. And once the idea is out there that you're going to settle for $22 million, it was never actually released, but I believe that's what it is, according to the evidence I've seen. But either way, it was a large sum of money. So you're going to settle for that kind of money, and that's going to kind of lead to false accusations, right? Once that gets out there, that you settle cases, that's not going to have a good result.
So, Dr. Grande begins with what on the surface seems like a plausible argument. Michael Jackson settles cases, and thus there's an incentive to manufacture these kind of allegations against him. But I think the part that Dr. Grande is skipping over here is that Michael Jackson settled a case with someone who accused him of child molestation. You would imagine that a guy who constantly wanted to be around little boys wouldn't want to pay $22 million and simultaneously destroy his public image. People argue pretty consistently online that he just didn't want to go through the trial, but if we're being honest here, that's pretty ludicrous. I can't think of anyone on earth who would be okay with everyone thinking they were a child molester just because they couldn't be, bothered with a civil trial. But moving on.
We also see that the FBI investigated Michael Jackson for over 10 years. We generally view them, at least I do, as competent. They're a competent law enforcement agency, and they didn't find anything. It seems like if something was going on, they would have found it.
So, again, Dr. Grande makes a point while skipping over the obvious. I don't think that the FBI investigated Michael Jackson for 10 years because they were bored. Michael Jackson was eventually prosecuted, even though the state failed to prove their case and he was acquitted. But I would argue that there's a good possibility that the reason that the state's case failed was because Michael Jackson had manipulated those boys into lying for him because they thought they were in love with him. And that's something Dr. Grande actually touched on in his own video.
In the 2005 trial, you see 14 charges and a not guilty verdict on all the charges. This really cannot be downplayed in terms of its significance. The prosecutors brought a case, and they failed to prove their case.
I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that the reason Michael Jackson wasn't able to be prosecuted successfully is because he had manipulated kids into protecting him later in life from that prosecution.
In spite of what they're claiming today, in 1993, both Robson and Safechuck denied being molested by Jackson when allegations were brought by another boy, Jordan Chandler. That case settled out of court. You all both tell a very descriptive story about, sexual activity with Michael Jackson, yet when you were asked to testify in 2005, and Wade, you did, you got on the stand and you testified in his behalf and vehemently denied that any sexual activity had taken place.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
The training, Michael's training of me to testify began the first night that he started abusing me. He started telling me that if anybody else ever finds out, we'll both go to jail. Both of our lives will be over.
The 2005 criminal trial of Michael Jackson centered on molestation charges brought by child cancer survivor named Gavin Arvizo. Court testimony shows that from the stand, Wade Robson denied ever kissing, showering, or even cuddling with Jackson. They credit your testimony in part for Michael's acquittal. You were called really a star witness. You withstood a blistering cross-examination, and he was acquitted. On some level, do you feel guilty about that now? Do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think about that. I have, and I do. I wish that I was ready. I wish that I could have helped Gavin Arvizo receive some justice and some validation for what happened to him. That was just like what happened to me and just like what happened to James. And I wish that I could have played a role in, at that point, stopping Michael from abusing however many other kids he did after that.
Do you think that there are others out there?
I do think there are others out there. But I also don't expect them to just come out now that we're coming out. It's such a difficult thing to do, to come out. You have to do it when you're ready.
We can't change what happened to us. It happened, it's done. But what can we do with it now? How can we provide comfort for other survivors? That's what this is about. And Michael just happens to be the guy, the abuser, in this child sexual abuse story.
The documentary went into detail about how Jackson basically mind-fucked those kids into thinking they were in love with him. which is something that Dr. Grande himself mentions is consistent with abuse victims.
So in terms of the elements that I found that did seem kind of believable, we see the mental health issues that Wade and James allege that they have, like depression and anxiety. These would be consistent with victims of this type of offending. Now, they could also be explained from the industry, right? They worked when they were young in Hollywood. That's a lot of pressure. But either way, I found this element to be believable in light of what I've heard before. There are conflicted feelings about Michael Jackson. They seem to kind of love him and be angry with him at the same time. I've seen that before. Lying for him, including testifying under oath. Possible. Yes, I think this is consistent, at least, with, again, other stories I've heard.
So which is it here? Because it can't be both. It's either consistent for victims of sexual abuse to feel feelings of love and want to protect their abusers, or it's not, because if it is, citing a prosecution which failed as a direct result of those victims protecting an alleged abuser wouldn't be significant, as Dr. Grande is suggesting here that it is. But moving on.
So he was found not guilty, and I think that has to matter at some level. We also see that in this trial, of course, I mentioned Wade Robson testified. And his story now has been that he didn't understand what happened as being abusive, right? So he knows what happened the whole time, but he didn't interpret it or perceive it as abuse. Now, in terms of James Safechuck, I mentioned that, of course, he didn't testify, but he claimed that Michael Jackson called and threatened him, basically threatening him because he wanted him to come testify on his behalf. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense either. You're going to threaten somebody and then have them on the stand where they can say anything? Also, there's really no corroboration for this particular type of behavior in Michael Jackson.
So James alleges that he met Michael Jackson on the set of a Pepsi commercial, and not long thereafter he began molesting him. I do find it more than a bit odd that some of the things that James said happened with Jackson were nearly identical to allegations made by other kids who James didn't even know, and they claim they were molested as well. You would have to believe that a bunch of people got together and came up with these detailed child romance stories where he gave them wedding rings and things were meant to make the child feel like they were in a romantic relationship. They all just so happen to be eerily similar to one another, but that's a total coincidence. Dr. Grande almost seems to imply that James or any of the other boys in the documentary that were called to the stand that later went on to accuse him of molestation, that Jackson having called them to the stand would have been odd and not something that he would have done if he was in fact guilty. But I think that it's kind of easy to overlook the power an abuser can have on someone who's being abused.
Why did you do that?
The training, Michael's training of me to testify began the first night that he started abusing me.
And specifically the power that Michael Jackson may have thought that he had over someone like James. And it also would kind of suggest that Michael Jackson made well thought out decisions in his life, which is, just to be honest here, laughable. I mean, that would be forgetting the fact that he had so much plastic surgery his face almost fell off. He paid $22 million to settle a child molestation case out of court and still kept sleeping in a bed with little boys. He dangled a baby off a balcony from a hotel room, and he eventually paid a doctor to anesthetize him to the point it actually killed him. Michael Jackson was not well known for making good decisions. He was well known for making good music. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that if these allegations were true, Jackson may have felt that he still had some kind of emotional control over these men.
Now, we also see kind of a key error in Leaving Neverland. James alleged that the abuse happened from 1988 to 1992, and one of the locations was the Neverland Ranch. He indicates that some of the abuse occurred in the train station during that time. The only problem is the train station wasn't built until 93-94. The permit was pulled in 93 and it was completed in 94. Now, the director, Dan Reed, says that the date they have wrong is the end of the abuse. So what he's really saying is the abuse went from 1988 to 1994, at least. Now, I find this unusual for a few reasons. One is, of course, it's technically inaccurate, right? They got caught with the whole train station thing. But second, offenders, if Michael Jackson was an offender, offenders don't like transitions between stages. Like, they don't like it when children go to being adolescents.
First off, they didn't get caught. That's implying that they lied without straight out calling them a liar. Asking someone to remember exact details of things that happened years ago when they were a child and being molested with perfect detail years and years later just isn't a reasonable expectation. There are mountains of evidence and studies that show that over time memories fade. We can sometimes tend to fill in the gaps of things that happened a long time ago. It's not that the things that you remember didn't happen. It's just that your version of those things can change over time.
The brain abhors a vacuum. Under the best of observation conditions, the absolute best, we only detect, encode, and store in our brains bits and pieces of the entire experience in front of us. And they're stored in different parts of the brain. So now when it's important for us to be able to recall what it was that we experienced, we have an incomplete, we have a partial store. And what happens? Below awareness, with no requirement for any kind of motivated processing, the brain fills in information that was not there.
As far as offenders not liking transitions between stages or ages and victims, I think it's fair to say that his transition is exactly when he said his abuse ended, and it's consistent with other men who claim to have been victimized by Jackson, that rough age range when it stopped. That and the age young people can go through transitions like that can vary. It's not a static thing, and the abuse did end roughly in that time period, albeit it was on the latter side of it. Dr. Grande goes on here to sum up his arguments by saying this.
So what it comes down to for Wade and James, I think, is this. They may be telling the truth, and we should hear them out. But they are, in my opinion, discredited. Right? Victims can do bad things too. They may be victims, but they are discredited because if you say something under oath in the justice system, at least in the United States, and I'm sure in many other countries, that means something. It's a foundational concept.
So Dr. Grande starts by saying that they might be telling the truth, but they discredited themselves by lying under oath. Now, let's not forget that these men are saying that Jackson groomed them into making them think that they were in love with him, and they truly believed they felt that way. And earlier in Dr. Grande's own video, he says that he's personally seen victims of abuse have that kind of feeling towards their abusers. So I very much fail to see how a child being manipulated and groomed like that, and it taking them into their adulthood to truly recognize what happened to them, I fail to see how that's a victim doing a bad thing.
There are conflicted feelings about Michael Jackson. They seem to kind of love him and be angry with him at the same time. I've seen that before. Lying for him, including testifying under oath. Possible. Yes, I think this is consistent, at least, with, again, other stories I've heard.
Obviously, a victim being manipulated into lying to protect their abuser isn't them doing something wrong or a bad thing. It's them being a victim.
Why did you do that?
The training, Michael's training of me to testify began the first night that he started abusing me.
Part of being victimized, like these men are alleging, is being groomed and manipulated in an age where they can't process and understand what's truly taking place. Putting a time frame on when a victim is able to come to terms with that just doesn't feel very reasonable to me.
Do you think that there are others out there?
I do think there are others out there, but I also don't expect them to just come out now that we're coming out. It's such a difficult thing to do, to come out. You have to do it when you're ready.
Suggesting that they're not credible because they were asked to lie under oath by a man who convinced them as children they were in love with him is just a very unfair argument to try to make here, and it's incredibly biased. It might have taken a long time for them to be able to confront and deal with the reality of what happened, but they eventually did do that. And as Dr. Grande said earlier, I don't think we can downplay the significance of that.
So this is a really controversial topic. A lot of people were upset by this movie, and we know that strong emotions tend to interfere with critical thinking. So this is one of those areas where it becomes hard to kind of figure out what happened, and it can be hard to even conduct the analysis, again, if people have strong emotions.
And with that being said, thank you so much for watching.